Georg Hegel's Philosophy of Mind, Section 1, The Subjective Mind, Subsection A, Anthropology, the Soul, Supersection B, The Feeling Soul, Soul as Sentiency, Die Fühlende Seele, Supra-subsection Gamma, Habit or Gewohnheit, Encyclopedia Section 409. Self-feeling, immersed in the detail of the feelings, in simple sensations, and also desires, instincts, passions, and their gratification, is undistinguished from them, but in the self there is latent a simple self relation of ideality, a nominal universality, which is the truth of these details. And as so universal, the self is to be stamped upon and made appear in this life of feeling, yet so as to distinguish itself from the particular details and be a realized universality, stamped upon as you would place a stamp on an envelope so that it may reach a place, or that you might put your seal or mark on something to identify it as yours, not place your foot on it to harm it. So as so universal, the self is to be stamped upon and made appear in this life of feeling, yet so as to distinguish itself from the particular details and be a realized universality. But this universality is not the full and sterling truth of the specific feelings and desires. What they specifically contain is as yet left out of account, and so too the particularity is, as now regarded, equally formal. It counts only as the particular being or immediacy of the soul in opposition to its equally formal and abstract realization. This particular being of the soul is the factor of its corporeity. Here we have it breaking with this corporeity, distinguishing it from itself a simple being, and becoming the ideal subjective substantiality of it, just as its latent notion, see Encyclopedia section 359, just as in its latent notion it was the substance and the mere substance of it. But this abstract realization of the soul in its corporal vehicle is not yet the self, not the existence of the universal which is for the universal. It is the corporeity reduced to it. It is the corporeity reduced to its mere ideality, and so far only does corporeity belong to the soul as such. That is to say, as space and time, the abstract one outside another, as in short, empty space and empty time are only subjective form, pure action of intuition, so that pure being, through the supersession, which through the supersession in it of the particularity of the corporeity, or of the immediate corporeity as such has realized itself, is mere intuition and no more, lacking consciousness, but the basis of consciousness, and consciousness it becomes when the corporeity, which it is in the subjective substance, which still comes to exist, and that as a barrier for it has been absorbed by it, and it has been invested with the character of self-centered subject. Section Encyclopedia section 410. The soul's making itself an abstract universal being and reducing the particulars of feeling and of consciousness to a mere feature of its being is habit. The soul's making itself an abstract universal being and reducing the particulars of feelings and of consciousness to a mere feature of its being is habit. In this manner, the soul has the contents in possession and contains them in such manner that in these features it is not as sentient, nor does it stand in relationship with them as distinguishing itself from them, nor is absorbed in them, but has moved and moves in them without feeling or consciousness of the fact. The soul is freed from them so far as it is not interested in or occupied with them, and whilst existing in these forms as its possession, it is at the same time open to be otherwise occupied and engaged, say with feeling and with mental consciousness in general. This process of building up the particular and corporal expressions of feeling into the being of the soul appears as a repetition of them, and the generation of habit as practice. For this being of the soul, if in respect of the natural particular phase it be called an abstract universality to which the former is transmuted, is a reflexive universality. See Encyclopedia section 175. In essence, the one and the same that recurs in a series of units of sensation is reduced to unity, and this abstract unity expressly stated. Habit, like memory, is a difficult point in mental organization. Habit is the mechanism of self feeling, as memory is the mechanism of intelligence. The natural qualities and alterations of sleep, the natural qualities and alterations of age, sleep, and waking are immediately natural. Habit, on the contrary, is the mode of feeling as well as intelligence, will, and similar, so far as they belong to self feeling, made into a natural and mechanical existence. Habit is rightly called a second nature. Nature, because it is an immediate being of the soul. A second nature, because it is an immediacy created by the soul, impressing and molding the corporality which enters into the modes of feeling as such and into the representations and volitions so far as they have taken corporal form. See Encyclopedia, section 401. Inhabit the human being's mode of existence is natural, and for that reason not free, but still free so far as the merely natural phase of feeling is by habit reduced to a mere being of his, and he is no longer involuntarily attracted or repelled by it, and so no longer interested, occupied, or dependent in regard to it. The want of freedom in habit is partly merely formal, as habit merely attaches to the being of the soul, partly only relative, so far as it, strictly speaking, arises only in the case of bad habits, or so far as a habit is opposed to another purpose, whereas the habit of right and goodness is an embodiment of liberty. The main point about habit is that by its means man gets emancipated from the feelings even in being affected by them. The different forms of this may be described as follows. Alpha, the immediate feeling is negated and treated as indifferent. One who gets inured against external sensation, frost, heat, weariness, and limbs, and such things, sweet taste, and such things, and who hardens the heart against misfortune, acquires a strength which consists in this, that although the frost and such things, or the misfortune is felt, the affection is deposed to a merely externality and immediacy. The universal psychical life keeps its own abstract independence in it, and the self feeling as such, consciousness, reflection, and any other purpose of an activity, and no longer bothered with it. Why do we say "in such things," or why does he say "in such things"? You'll see an ampersand in the C. Because to give more examples could cause an impression which could lead to a habit. Beta, there is indifference toward the satisfaction. The desires and impulses are by the habit of their satisfaction deadened. This is the rational liberation from them, whereas monastic renunciation and forcible interference do not free from them, nor are they in conception rational. Of course, in all this, it is assumed that the impulses are kept as the finite modes they naturally are, and that they, like their satisfaction, are subordinate as partial factors to the reasonable will. Gamma. In habit regarded as aptitude or skill, not merely has the abstract psychical life to be kept intact per se, but it has to be imposed as a subjective aim, to be made power to be made a power in the bodily part, which is rendered subject and thoroughly previous to it, conceived as having the inward purpose of the subjective soul, thus imposed upon it. The body is treated as an immediate externality and a barrier. Thus comes out the mere decided Thus comes out the more decided rupture between the soul as simple self concentration and its earlier naturalness and immediacy. It has lost its original and immediate identity with the bodily nature, and as external has first to be reproduced and as external has first to be reduced to that position. Thus comes out the more decided rupture between the soul as simple self concentration and its earlier naturalness and immediacy. It has lost its original and immediate identity with the bodily nature, and as external has first to be reduced to that position. Specific feelings can only get bodily shape in a perfectly specific way. See Encyclopedia section 401. And the immediate portion of body is a particular possibility for a specific aim, a particular aspect of its differentiated structure, a particular organ of its organic system. To mold such an aim in the organic body is to bring out and express to mold such an aim in the organic body is to bring out and express the ideality which is implicit in matter always, and especially so in the specific bodily part, and thus to enable the soul, under its volitional and conceptual characters, to exist as substance in its corporeity. In this way, an aptitude shows the corporeity rendered completely pervious, made into an instrument so that when the conception, ergo a series of musical notes, is in me, then without resistance and with ease the body gives them correct utterance. The form of habit applies to all kinds of grades of mental action. The most external of them, in essence, the spatial direction of an individual, by way of his upright posture, has been by will made a habit, a position taken without adjustment and without consciousness, which continues to be an affair of his persistent will. For the man stands only because and insofar as he wills to stand, and only so long as he wills it without consciousness. Similarly, our eyesight is the concrete habit which, without an express adjustment, combines in a single act the several modifications of sensation, consciousness, intuition, intelligence, and similar, which make it up. Thinking, too, however free and active in its own pure element it becomes, no less requires habit and familiarity, this impromptuity or form of immediacy by which it is the property of my single self, where I can freely and in all directions range. It is through this habit that I come to realize my existence as a thinking being. Even here in this spontaneity of self centered thought, there is a partnership of soul and body, hence, want of habit and too long continued thinking cause headache. Habit diminishes this feeling by making the natural function and immediacy of the soul. Habit on an ampler scale and carried out in the strictly intellectual range is recollection and memory, whereof we shall speak later. Habit is often spoken of disparagingly and called lifeless, casual, and particular. And it is true that the form of habit, like any other, is open to anything we chance to put into it, and it is habit of living which brings on death, or, if quite abstract, is death itself. And yet, habit is indispensable for the existence of all intellectual life in the individual, enabling the subject to be a concrete immediacy and ideality of soul, enabling the matter of consciousness, religion, and moral, enabling the matter of consciousness, religious, moral, and such things to be his as this self, this soul, and no other, and be neither a mere latent possibility nor a transient emotion or idea, nor an abstract inwardness cut off from action and reality, but part and parcel of his being. In scientific studies of the soul and the mind, habit is usually passed over, either as something contemptible, or rather for the further reason that it is one of the most difficult questions of psychology. Subsection A, Anthropology, the soul. Supersection C, the actual soul. Encyclopedia section 411. The soul, with its corporeity, has been molded and made thoroughly its own, finds itself there a single subject, and the corporeity is an externality which stands as a predicate, in being related to which it is related to itself. This externality, in other words, represents not itself, but the soul, of which it is a sign. In this identity of interior and exterior, the latter subject to the former, the soul is actual. In its corporeity, it has its free shape, in which it feels itself and makes itself felt, and which, as the soul's work of human, and which, as the soul's work of art, has human, pathognomic, and physiognomic expression. Under the head of human expression are included, ergo, the upright figure in general, and the formation of the limbs, especially the hand, and the absolute instrument of the mouth, laughter and weeping and such, and the note of mentality diffused over the whole, which at once announces the body at the externality of a higher nature. This note is so slight, indifferent this note is so slight, indefinite, and inexpressible a modification because the figure, in its externality, is something immediate and natural, and can therefore only be an indefinite and quite imperfect sign for the mind, unable to represent it in its actual universality. Seen from the animal world, the human figure is the supreme phase in which mind makes an appearance, but for the mind it is only its first appearance, while language is its perfect expression, and the human figure, though it though its proximate phase of existence is at the same time in its physiognomic and pathognomic quality, something contingent to it, to try to raise physiognomy and, above all, cranioscopy, phrenology, to the rank of science, was therefore one of the vainest fancies, still vainer than a signatura rerum, which supposed the shape of a plant to afford indications of its medicinal value. Encyclopedia section 412. Implicitly, the soul shows the untruth and unreality of matter, for the soul in its concentrated self cuts itself off from its immediate being, placing the latter over against it as a corporeity incapable of offering resistance to its molding influence. The soul, thus setting in opposition its being to its conscious self, absorbing it and making it its own, has lost the meaning of mere soul, or the immediacy of mind. The actual soul, with its sensation and its concrete self feeling, turned into habit, has implicitly realized the identity of its qualities. In this externality, it has recollected and inwardized itself and is infinite self relation. This free universality, thus made explicit, shows the soul awakening to the higher stage of the ego, or abstract universality insofar as it is for the abstract universality. In this way, it gains the position of thinker and subject, specifically a subject of the judgment in which the ego excludes from itself the sum total of its mere natural features as an object, a world external to it, with such respect that with such respect to that object that in it it is immediately reflected into itself, thus soul rises to become consciousness. Georg Hegel, Philosophy of Mind, Section 1, The Subjective Mind, The Subjective Mind, Subsection B, which came after subsection A, Anthropology, the Soul. Now we're at subsection B, Phenomenology of Mind, Consciousness. So the soul has risen to become consciousness. Phenomenology of mind is where we are now, and consciousness. Uh, Encyclopedia, section 413. Consciousness constitutes the reflected or correlational grade of mind. The grade of mind as appearance. Ego is infinite self relation of mind, but as subjective or as self certainty. The immediate identity of the natural soul has been raised to this pure ideal self identity, and what the former contained is for this and what the former contained is for this self subsistent reflection set forth as an object. The pure abstract freedom of mind lets go from its specific qualities, the soul's natural life, to an equal freedom as an independent object. It is of this latter, as external to it, that the ego is in the first instance aware, conscious, and as such it is consciousness. Ego, as this absolute negativity, is implicitly the identity in the otherness. The ego is itself the other and stretches over the object as if that object were implicitly cancelled. It is one side of the relationship and the whole relationship, the light which manifests itself in something else too. Encyclopedia, section 414. The self identity of the mind, thus first made explicit as the ego, is only its abstract formal identity. As soul, it was under the phase of substantial universality. Now, as subjective reflection in itself, it is referred to this substantiality as to its negative, something dark and beyond it. Hence, like reciprocal, consciousness, like reciprocal dependence in general, is the contradiction between the independence of the two sides and their identity in which they are merged into one. The mind as ego is essence, but since reality in the sphere of essence is represented as an immediate being, and at the same time as ideal, it is as consciousness only the appearance phenomenon of mind. Encyclopedia, section 415. As the ego is by itself only a formal identity, the dialectical movement of its intelligible unity, in essence, the successive steps and further specification of consciousness, does not to it seem to be its own activity, but is implicit, and to the ego it seems an alteration of the subject. Consciousness consequently appears differently modified according to the difference of the given subject, and the gradual specification of consciousness appears as a variation in the characteristics of its objects. Ego, the subject of consciousness, is thinking. The logical process of modifying the object is what is identical in subject and object, their absolute interdependence, what makes the object the subject's own. the Kantian philosophy may be more accurately described as having viewed the mind as consciousness, and as containing the propositions only of a phenomenology, not of a philosophy of mind. The ego Kant, re- the ego Kant regards as reference to something away and beyond, which in its abstract description is termed the thing at itself. And it is only from this finite point of view that he treats both intellect and will. Though in the notion of a power of reflective judgment, he touches upon the idea of mind, a subject objectivity, and intuitive intellect and such, and even the idea of nature, still this idea is again deposed to an appearance, in essence to a subjective maxim. See Encyclopedia, section 58. Reinhold may therefore be said to have correctly appreciated Kantianism when he treated it as a theory of consciousness under the name of faculty of ideation. Fichte kept to the same point of view. His non ego is only something set over against the ego, only defined as in consciousness. It is made no more than an infinite shock, in essence, a thing in itself. But systems, therefore, have clearly not reached the intelligible unity or the mind as it actually and essentially is, but only as it is in reference to something else. As against Spinozaism, again, it is to be noted that the mind in the subject by which it constitutes itself an ego, a free subject contrasted with its qualitative affection, has emerged from substance, and that the philosophy which gives this judgment as the absolute characteristic of mind, has emerged from Spinozism. Encyclopedia section 416. The aim of conscious mind is to make its appearance identical with its essence, to raise its self certainty to truth. The existence of mind in the stage of consciousness is infinite because it is merely a nominal self relation or mere certainty. The object is only abstractly characterized as its. In other words, in the object, it is only as an abstract ego that the mind is reflected into itself. Hence, its existence there has still a content, which is not as its own. Section Encyclopedia section 417. The grade of this elevation of certainty to truth are three in number. First, A, consciousness in general, with an object set against it. B, self consciousness, for which ego is the object. C, unity of consciousness and self consciousness, where the mind sees itself embodied in the object and sees itself as implicitly and explicitly determinate as reason, the notion of mind. So Hegel, philosophy of mind, subsection B, phenomenology of mind, consciousness, supersection A, consciousness proper, das Bewusstsein als solches, das sinnliche Bewusstsein. Supra, subsection alpha, sensuous consciousness. Encyclopedia section 418. Consciousness is first immediate consciousness, and its reference to the object accordingly, the simple and underived certainty of it, the object similarly being immediate and existent, reflected in itself, is further characterized as immediately singular. This is self consciousness. Consciousness, as a case of correlation, comprises only the categories belonging to the abstract ego or formal thinking, and these it treats as features of the object. See Encyclopedia section 415. Since consciousness, therefore, is aware of the object as an existent, a something, an existing thing, a singular, and so on, it appears as wealthiest in matter, but as poorest in thought. That wealth of matter is made out of sensation. They are the material of consciousness. Encyclopedia section 414, the substantial and qualitative, what the soul in its anthropological sphere is and finds in itself. This material, the ego, the reflection of the soul in itself, separates from itself and puts it first under the category of being. Spatial and temporal singularness, here and now, the term by which, in the Phenomenology of Mind, W2 page 73, I describe the object of self consciousness, strictly belongs to intuition. At present, the object is at first to be viewed only in its correlation to consciousness, in essence, a something external to it, and not yet as external on its own part, or as being outside or as being beside or out of itself. Encyclopedia section 419. The sensible as somewhat becomes an other. The reflection in itself of that somewhat the thing has many properties, and as a single thing in its immediacy has several predicates. The muchness of the sense singular thus becomes a breath, a variety of relationship, the muchness of the sense singular thus becomes a breath, a variety of relations, reflectional attributes, and universalities. These are logical terms introduced by the thinking principle, in essence, in some case by the ego to describe the sensible, but the ego as itself apparent sees in all this characterization a change in the subject and self consciousness, so construing the object in sense perception. Beta, self perception, Encyclopedia section 420. Consciousness, having passed beyond the sensibility, wants to take the object in its truth, not as merely immediate, but as mediated, reflected in itself and universal. Such an object is a combination of sense qualities with attributes of wide range by which thought defines concrete relations and connections. Hence, the identity of consciousness with the object passes from the abstract identity of I am sure to the definite identity of I know and am aware. The particular grade of consciousness on which Kantianism conceives the mind is perception, which is also the general point of view taken by ordinary consciousness and more or less by the sciences, the sensuous certitudes of single apperceptions, the sensuous certitudes of single apperceptions, the sensuous certitudes of single apperceptions or observations form the starting point. These are supposed to be elevated to truth by being regarded in their bearings, reflected upon, and on the lines of definite categories, turned at the same time into something natural and universal by way of experiences. Encyclopedia, section 421. The conjunction of individual and universal is admixture. The individual remains at the bottom hard and unaffected by the universal, to which, however, it is related. It is therefore a tissue of contradictions between the single things of sense apperceptions which form the alleged ground of general experience, and the universality which has a higher claim to be the essence and ground between the individuality of a thing which, taken in its concrete contents, constitutes its independence and the various properties which, free from this negative link and from one another, are independent universal matters. See Encyclopedia section 123. This contradiction of the finite, which runs through all forms of the logical spheres, turns out most concrete when the somewhat is defined as object. See Encyclopedia section 194 and the sequence. Gamma, the intellect. Der Verstand, der Verstand. Encyclopedia section 422. The proximate truth of perception is that it is the object which is an appearance, and that the object's reflection in self is on the contrary a self-subsistent, inward, and universal. The consciousness of such an object is intellect. This inward, as we called it, of the thing is on one hand the suppression of the multiplicity of the sensible, and in that matter an abstract identity. On the other hand, however, it also, for that reason, contains the multiplicity, but as an interior simple difference, which remains self identical in the vicissitudes of appearance. The simple difference is the realm of the laws of the phenomena, a copy of the phenomenon, but brought to rest in universality. Encyclopedia section 423, the law at first stating the mutual dependence of universal, permanent terms has, insofar as its distinction is the inward one, its necessity on its own part, the one of the terms, as not externally different from the other, lies immediately in the other, but in this manner the interior distinction is what it is in truth, the distinction on its own part, or the distinction which is none. With this new form characteristic, on the whole, consciousness implicitly vanishes. For consciousness as such implies the reciprocal dependence of subject and object. The ego, in its judgment, has an object which is not distinct from it. It has itself. Consciousness has passed into self consciousness.